Hey guys, how's it going? We're going to be doing Tsotsi by Athol Fugard, chapter 3. He walked out of the shebeen and into the street where the sky was low with storm clouds, which had last rolled over the township and the street itself. Slow with couples in the dark, and people lounged around in gentle attitudes of waiting for the rain. He kept his back to the shebeen and the street before him, broad as a river as it was with the eddies of life, and on the corners and around the lamppost and the sluggish drift on the pavements, walking through this without once looking back to the room where Butcher and Diab were whistling through their teeth, and Suki was telling them to make unconscious man out of her place. All of this while her gramophone repeated unheeded the meaningless phrase of its lost groove. Walking away, he passed somewhere the woman the two men had been taken but earlier, returning now with wet thighs for the drink she had earned, but Tsotsi had no thought for her or the others, seeing only Boston, hearing again his words. He saw Boston at the moment when he had raised himself on the floor and spoken. Seeing him like that, with the blood on his mouth and the strange look in his eyes, Tsotsi knew the others had pulled him off before he had finished. He wanted to work a long time on Boston. He had only started. He was not released from the torment of his hate. He also heard him again, hearing the words, but without their meaning. In those final, insensate moments when he went to work on Boston, his mind had taken up the words, and like the dice rattled them out of sequence and shape, throwing them now, as he walked down the street, back into his ears. One day, God help you that day. One day you won't know what to do. They caught the rhythm of his walking. It will happen will happen one day, it will happen. God help you that day, one day. He stopped, and with his hands on his ears and his eyes shut, he rolled his head from side to side. But that didn't help, because the sight of him and his sound was inside, right inside. Tsotsi looked around desperately. He was near a lamppost, and underneath it, crouched in a circle, was a group of men dicing for money. When they saw him walking their way, they stopped their game, looked at each other, and then without a word pocketed their money and drifted away into the night. In a house across the street, a party was underway. Tsotsi stood still and tried to see it, the noise of it, the music and laughter and droning undertones of talk. Big talk, small talk, love talk, or just the babble of a drunk. This and the light and the smoke from the cigarettes was pouring out of the doors and windows, and these were thrown open to their widest as if for fear the walls could not contain it all. At the moment that Tsotsi stood watching, two girls came running out of the door, hand in hand, laughing their way down the street. And a moment later, a man in hot pursuit, a bottle in his hand, calling after them, drinking as he ran. Tsotsi had almost succeeded in seeing all of this, when the man slipped and fell in the street, sprawled the way Boston had been on the floor when he first went down. The girls laughed somewhere, and the man raised himself on one arm and called out to them. But Tsotsi didn't hear him, not even seeing him anymore. because that way he was even more like Boston, speaking through his blood. The image came back, and the words as well, and it was worse than before. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists and walked again down the street, heedless of the people he pushed aside and the curses that snapped at his heels like small dogs, opening his eyes in time to a quickened pace that carried him sly as a shadow past other doors, other windows where light and murmurs and occasional laughter also fell in the dust, past corrugated iron fences with their slogans of a better world, where the wet paint of the slogans had run a time back, leaving the words streaked as if with tears. But even his rhythm, or that of his heart, or any of the other rhythms around him in the night, dog barking, dog whining, the thin note of a penny whistle climbing somewhere in the darkness, a baby born, a cry, all of these in the same conspiracy of intention, finding that meter and meaning of Boston's words. One day it will happen, will happen, will happen. The feeling will happen one day, and God help you that day, one day, that day. So that at the corner where the church stood humbly, its cross affirming that God moved amongst men at night, where he threw back his head, and of that moment, and those who saw him coming their way stepped aside, and all who saw him stopped and watched him pass. "Q," they said, "a mad one." But they were not graciously surprised. There were many. In a few seconds he was at the end of the street, and like a buck he leapt through the last of the light and into the darkness that ringed the township, making its limits and the start of the no-man's land between it and the white suburb. It was here where he finally broke the spell of Boston and his words. He pushed his body to its limit, working his legs and his lungs until his mind went blank, and then keeping it on. For a long time it must have been, because when he stopped and leaned against the lamppost, he was in a strange street, in a different place, and at first everything was spinning around his head, while the blood pounded in his ears. He stayed there, holding onto the lamppost, for some time, his eyes shut while he sucked in and swallowed air with a desperate sound. Soon he was breathing easier, and the pounding was gone from his ears. When more time passed, and he still had not seen Boston again, or heard him, then he knew he was safe. He opened his eyes. The lights of a car had swung into the street further down, and were coming towards him. Tsotsi left the lamppost and slipped into the darkness. It could be the police. The white suburbs near the township were well patrolled. He didn't stop again until a long time later, when somewhere in the night the clock chimed an hour and he didn't bother to count. Soon after leaving the lamppost where he had rested, the rain had fallen. There wasn't much of it. For all he knew, it might have missed the township, where they would have gone to bed, sighing and sweating and wondering why it came so close, and then it didn't come at all. Tsotsi heard the warning roll of thunder, vaulted distant. He saw the lightning over the rooftops, sudden, very white, like a woman shaking her sheets at her back door. And then it came, first in a few heavy drops that rattled on the leaves of the trees he was passing, and then as a drifting cloud of coolness, almost mist, it was so light. Street lamps shrunk to a glowing golden monoliths, spaced at mournful intervals down the street, and then shining like a belt of blackness with the grass like powdered glass on either side. He lifted his chin and caught the feel of it on his face, and he was completely at peace for a moment. He prowled the streets, turning irrationally on sudden impulses, and no one even asking himself why he had chosen one way and not the other. Curtains on windows, dogs at the gates. Drifting rain was with him for a while time, and then it poured and came from the clouds, lumbered away silently overhead, leaving the room for the moon. Rooftops, left wet by the rain, shone brilliant in the moonlight. It was suddenly a white world, a prismatic, polished, gleaming world of white surfaces, the streets, the moon-washed walls and rooftops, almost a glacial white. This quality was caught by his ear as well. In the wet, soft, shrunken, curled-up moments of the rain, there had been silence. But now, with the rain gone, excited by the moonlight, the crickets had come back. It was a hard, leaping, crystal sound defining the smaller facets of the moment. They were busy on the hedges, under the stones in the gardens, and the trees, and in the distant ones seemed to sound as distant echoes of those around him. The clock struck somewhere, and it was all silent for a moment as they listened, and Tsotsi stopped and also listened for a while to the dull, discordant toll that did not bother to count. Ahead of him was a grove of bluegum trees, and because he was tired, suddenly very tired, he turned that way, meaning to rest. When he reached the trees, there were about 20. He slipped quietly to the middle and stood for a moment, quite still, noticing for the first time that there was a slight breeze. The moonlight lay around him in pools, splashing over roots and dry leaves, mobile as quicksilver, and as the treetops moved gently, and their shadows shifted on the ground. The wind was just a whisper among the leaves, and branches creaked intermittently with dry, complaining sounds. Tsotsi drew in a deep breath. The air was damp and drenched with heavy scent of bluegums. His eyes opened wide, mirrored cataracts of light splashing around him. He was content, and stood like that for a long time, until his legs throbbed and he remembered he was tired. He sat down with his back to a tree, and no sooner was he comfortable than he regretted it, because immediately the image of Boston rose up before him. He shouldn't have stopped here, he thought. I should have kept on until I could go no more. He was not that tired that he couldn't have stood up. The ache in his legs was no worse than a 10-day-old knife wound. He could have risen to his feet and carried on to another place, another destiny, because the stars were busy that night. But instead he chose to remain, and in remaining picked up the silken thread of the chances that were to lead him a strange way. And so the image of Boston, considered now, his violence was spent, without the madness of hate. Boston! He, Tsotsi, had himself picked Boston from the 1,000 lives adrift in the location streets. He had picked Boston because he had a virtue, just as Diab had a virtue, which was strength, inhuman strength, and Butcher with his virtue, which was the accuracy that had earned him his name, an accuracy as reliable as the edge of a good knife. Boston's virtue being that he was clever. He was a lot of other things as well. He was a coward. He was weak. He talked too much. He drank even more than he talked. But more important than anything else, he was clever. He could think. Boston had already proved himself 100 times over. In as many jobs, his cleverness had engineered success. The little details that got you caught, these Boston thought about. In a panic of fear was true, but he thought about them, and that was all that mattered. It was simple, and it would have worked for a long time if it had only stayed like that. Where had it all gone wrong? It had gone wrong because Boston had started asking questions, even after he was warned, and Tsotsi had not known the answers. When he thought of himself inwardly, Tsotsi thought of darkness. Inwardly there was darkness, something like the midnight hour, only more obscure. At night, when he lay on his bed, it was almost in one continuum of obscurity. As dark without as within, the separation being his flesh. Sleep was the moment when it happened, when he merged and everything was black. He never dreamed. This did not disconcert him, provided he lived according to a set, tried and tested rules. He didn't know where they came from, but he had them, and if he failed to observe them, the trouble started. The first rule was a rule of the waking moment. That moment always came as a miracle, a sudden eruption of light as he opened his eyes, and sound as well as sensation, feeling and smelling, being born 20 years old, with the smell of the womb in your nostrils, and its darkness behind your back. It was a moment of great peril, because the impact of the world around him on his senses was like a flood that threatened to tear him away from his moorings and cast him adrift on a few-day aimless as the others, caught in the wanton tides of the location streets. It was at this moment that his first rule operated. It was simply that before anything else, eating, washing, pissing, he had to see his knife. It was a sheath knife, the blade 4 inches long. The handle was made of wood and was kept in place by 2 copper studs, and he carried it in the back pocket of his trousers and slept with it under his jacket, which he rolled up and used as a pillow. He would take it out in the room in the morning and look at it. It meant testing the edge on the soft ball of the thumb, and if it couldn't shave off a thin wafer of skin, then sharpening it. He used a stone for this, which he kept in his room. Sharpening it was, as someone had once shown him, to spit on the stone, and then to work the blade lightly backwards and forwards. And if it wasn't in need of sharpening, he would simply play with it for a few seconds, enjoying the security of it in his hand. He knew the knife. The feel of it was familiar, its purpose obvious. It was his, and he knew how to use it. These thoughts were cast like mooring ropes and tied him firmly to what he knew. Whatever the case might be, the blade dull or as keen as sight, when he put it away in his pocket and looked up, the day was his. He, Tsotsi, knew himself and his dark purpose, and everything was all right. The knife was not only his weapon, but also a fetish, a talisman that conjured away bad spirits and established him securely in his life. His second rule, which operated from when on through every other moment of the day, was never to disturb his inward darkness with the light of a thought about himself or the attempt at a memory. He was not only resigned to not knowing about himself, he didn't want to know anything. This was an instinctive caution in Tsotsi to leave well alone. It was also the hardest of all his rules, because of the independent and irrational nature of life. There was only a limited area that he controlled absolutely. The vaster regions of it operated regardless of him, sometimes running against his purpose. Sometimes something simple would catch a sense, something evocative of something in his past. The smell of a wet newspaper did it, and it would stir and start associations charged with pain and mystery inside him. Once, feeling secure in his bedroom, he had seen a spider working at its web in a corner of the ceiling, and seeing this, he had known a moment of acute terror, and had passed a night without sleep, almost hypnotized by the spider, too frightened to kill it. And all he knew was that the insect, inexplicably, had evoked terror, and that something frightened and very small had moved within him. Sometimes these encounters with his past were of a more definite nature, like the time he and Diop and Butcher were rolling dice near the station, and Butcher nudged him, and all three of them looked up. A policeman was walking down the road towards them, wheeling a bicycle with one hand, the other dragging by the jacket a man who was handcuffed. One policeman, one prisoner in a deserted street. Butcher had smiled. Diop might have laughed, while Tsotsi waited and watched. The policeman saw them, and he slowed down a little, then tightened his hold on the man and walked on to them. The prisoner was young, maybe Tsotsi's age, but as thin as hunger can make a man, with those large shiny eyes that go with it. He had been eaten. There was a trickle of blood from his nose. Tsotsi watched him, vaguely uneasy at first, more so than the man saw him, and his face lit up with recognition, and he looked quickly at the policeman and smiled suddenly, with a wild hope. Butcher nudged Tsotsi. "Okay," he asked. But Tsotsi didn't answer. He was remembering the face, but in his memory it had seemed younger, and the body under the face was of that of a boy. A child with knobby knees and empty hands. There was a memory of boys scavenging the townships. Beyond that, he had never gone. When the policeman and his prisoner were abreast from them, he still hadn't moved, or given the word to the others. They looked at him perplexed. The smile on the prisoner's face was going, and he looked hard at Tsotsi, hoping very hard. Butcher nudged him, and he might have moved then, but the prisoner looked at him desperately as he paused and called him by a strange name. "David," he said. Tsotsi looked away, picked up the dice and rolled them. "David!" the man called. "David!" Tsotsi looked away. "It's me, Ptah. David, help me." David called, all the way down the street. But Tsotsi had closed his ears. He heard it no more. He forgot it. The right there and then. Knowing it was a voice from his past, he made himself forget. Under the bewildered gaze of Butcher and Diop, he rattled the dice and played on. That incident, and the memories it had invoked, was the furthest Tsotsi had ever gone back into his past. His third and final rule was really an extension of the second. It was the rule Boston had broken. Tsotsi tolerated no questions from another. It wasn't just that he caught without answers. It went deeper than that. Those questions sounded the vast depths of his darkness, making it tangible reality. To know nothing about yourself is to be constantly in danger of nothingness, those voids of non-being over which a man walks the tightrope of his life. Tsotsi feared nothingness. He feared it because he believed in it. Even more than that, he knew with all certainty of his being that behind the facade of life lurked nothing. Under men's prayers he had heard the deep silence of night. Behind man's beauty he had seen it faceless and waiting. Inside man himself, beyond the lights of his loves and his hopes, there was too nothing. A darkness like an enormous unending night that closed in when the fires burned low and out, feeling only ash as an epitaph of their passing warmth. The problem of his life was to maintain himself, to affirm his existence in the face of this nullity. He achieved this through pain and fear, and through death. He knew no other way. When Gumboot died, and in those last few seconds before death, he had looked hard with hate and then fear at the young man who had chosen him. That moment, Tsotsi had known he was alive. It was as simple as that. Tsotsi still sat with his back to the tree, with these thoughts, or his equivalents of them, the personal spectres that carried their meaning, some visual, seen inwardly like the face of his first killing. Others felt like the twitch in the nerves of his groin when he had savoured the meaning of killing. These had been passing through his head for a long time, and now he was tired. He was not good at thinking. He stood up, determined to run again, to leave the trees. He was already moving when he heard the sound, so he stopped, slipped quietly into a shadow, and waited. What he heard were footsteps, about 10 at a time, coming at regular intervals as someone moved down the street, crossing the silent squares of grass on the pavement, and then the driveways to the garages, with the sound of a shoe on cement. They were regular but rapid, the rhythm of hurry and fear, almost a run. When he heard them coming steadily closer, Tsotsi moved to one of the trees on the edge of the grove. It was a young woman, a black woman, coming towards him in the night. She was wearing a long coat, unbuttoned, and underneath it he could see a white garment that could have been a petticoat. She carried a small parcel, and she kept on looking back. From his position under the tree, Tsotsi recognized without hesitation the symptoms of fear. Nothing else moved a human being the same way. He had seen it often. She held her parcel as if it were her last hold on life itself. Even if her hands were empty, they would hold themselves, hand holding hand. She was nearer now, and he could see that her parcel was a shoebox. Fear too, and fear alone, made you see a threat of danger in every shadow, which was how she was, her head turning constantly from side to side. But most of all, fear made you hurry. She was caught in an ungainly rhythm between walking and running, almost tripping over her feet in a hurry. Almost, or once or twice, with a few steps quicker than the rest. It seemed as if she was about to break into a run, but each time something stopped her and she fell back into a stumbling lope. Tsotsi watched her from under the trees. Without realizing it, his heart began to beat faster. It was almost perfect. The woman came towards him in the night. He didn't know her. He didn't hate, but he slipped slyly from the tree to the point where she would enter the grove. He didn't know what he was going to do, but his fingers flexed at his sides. His hands were ready. She was opposite him now, waving, having paused on her way to lean against a wall to shake her head. She crossed the street and walked into the grove of blue gum trees. He caught her by one arm and swung her into the darkness, his hand cutting short the scream of terror that had fallen from her lips like splintered glass. A second move forced her against the tree there, and there, with his body pressed against hers, knee already between her legs, his hand still on her mouth. There he looked into her eyes. She struggled once, but he held her firmly. He clutched her shoebox, an even greater desperation. For a few seconds, neither moved. He studied her calmly, her eyes, her neck, with the pulse of an artery under the warm skin, deliberating his next move while the warmth of her body crept into his, and her breasts, full and firm, panicked under the weight of her chest. Unknowingly, he relaxed his grip. With a twist of her hand, she freed a corner of her mouth and screamed a second time. But before he could do anything, his attention was torn away from her to the shoebox she carried. He released her and stepped back sharply. She had stopped her scream and was staring now at the box with a horror deeper than her fear of him. With both hands she lifted it, and when nothing happened, she held it up to him, and for a second time he backed away. With a sudden movement, she thrust it into his hands. He held it clumsily. Tsotsi only had eyes for the box now, and ears too, neither seeing nor hearing the woman as she turned away with a slow sob and ran back the way she had come, deep into the white night. The lid had slipped off, and the sudden impulse of her generosity, Tsotsi had found himself looking at a face that was small and black and older than anything he had ever seen in his life. It was lined and wrinkled with an age beyond years. The sound that had stopped him and saved the woman was the cry of a baby.